So, hi everybody. 45 years have passed, almost to the day, since I actually left Angola after spending a couple of months there during a very, very top secret war that South Africa fought there. And I'm assuming that the audience here today is actually mainly South African and South Africans who at the time were in South Africa in 1975 and never ever really heard anything actually took place up in Angola. Some snippets maybe afterwards or years afterwards, and it just kind of quietly died out due to all the strict censorship and people making aliyah and leaving elsewhere. And for 45 years, this has been quiet. The reason why I'm talking about it today is just over the last few years, what with Facebook, we have a few hundred members of veterans of South Africans who all were in Angola, most of them not having known one another. And slowly but surely over the last 5 years, this group has kind of got together, their books being written and information being shared. So without further ado, this is the first time I'm going to be telling snippets of how I got involved and what my involvement was about. Okay, so on the 12th of December, 1975, this picture was taken. So it's last week, 45 years ago. That's me sitting in a Toyota Land Cruiser, not a South African army vehicle, of course, and a couple of black FNLA troops next to us. I was the signaller driver, actually, for this particular major, he was the South African army guy who actually trained all the FNLA troops in secret bases in southern Angola prior to the actual operation, which was named Operation Savannah. And I just want to tell you a little bit about this picture because we were about to actually cross from Angola into Southwest Africa. We had been driving now for 3 full days down south, 1,000 kilometers. And that's basically just to give you an idea how deep inside Angola we were. With me, not in this particular picture, you'll see later, was actually also Commandant Breitenbach, who was he was the renowned commander of the South African Recce Battalion, which is similar to the British SAS. And we had trained, not myself, I wasn't involved in the training of the FNL soldiers for 2 months prior to this operation. But with us, you don't see them, there were a couple of kind of cattle trucks where all these FNL soldiers were in, driven by other members of the One Reconnaissance Commando, which are the Recces, as we know them, we knew them in South Africa. I just spent 2 months up in Angola. I'd seen death and destruction, anarchy, war, the breakdown of society. I hadn't slept in the same place for more than a few days for over 2 months. And that goes back to the middle of October when we first drove in. I hadn't seen home for 9 months. I hadn't spoken home for over 3 months, no letters, no phone calls. And who knows what my parents, family, or friends actually thought where I was or what I'd been going through. I wasn't, if you look carefully, I wasn't wearing South African uniform. We had no identification on us whatsoever. I hadn't shaved for 2 months, not that that would have been an issue for those who know me. I hadn't either had a meal prepared in all these 2 months. We would just be eating out of rations or whatever all this time. I'd been also totally separated from all my fellow soldiers from my original unit from Walvis Bay. I just turned 19. And let me tell you how this all came about. But first, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background before my personal story of what actually was going on in Angola at that time. So, you know, for those who may have forgotten, there were 3 different groups, guerrilla groups fighting against the Portuguese before the Portuguese decided to leave. That was the FNLA, the MPLA, and the UNITA. We went in under cover of FNLA and UNITA fighters, okay? And we're going to show you a video now, just 4 months of, yeah, you can go. Okay, and we're going to show you a video which is going to be basically covering these 3 organizations and what took place in the beginning of Angola that led to South Africa's invasion, if you want to call it, of Angola at that particular time. So just starting, the Portuguese government decides to pull out of Angola after about 300 years. So fighting breaks out between these three underground factions, not to compare, please, to the Legi Etzel and Agana. No, okay, but they also had three factions there. And because of the fighting, South Africa sent troops up to the hydroelectric project on the Southwest Africa-Angola border. Okay, the Portuguese troops moved out. Portugal said that whoever's in charge of Angola or running Angola by the 11th of November, they're going to form the new government. So it was a race against the clock as to who's going to control Angola by the 11th of November. Let's see the video. I'm just going to show you 4 minutes. And it'll give you a little bit of, recollection and understanding of what actually and how.
And the people of Angola reached for freedom. Fresh hunting grounds for the Cold War superpowers.
Is that okay, Ted?
Everything's good.
As Portuguese troops pulled out of Angola, three groups jostled for power. America's fears were aroused.
When Bill Colby, the CIA director, went to brief the National Security Council in the White House the first time on this, his briefing was literally, gentlemen, this is a map of Africa, and here is Angola. Now in Angola we have three factions. There's the MPLA, they're the bad guys. The FNLA, they're the good guys. And there's UNITA and Jonas Savimbi we don't know too well. And that was to get the National Security Council involved in this thing.
The Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA, the largest group, was left-wing. Based in and around the capital, Luanda, its multi-ethnic membership was led by Agostinho Neto and Lucio Lara. In the 1960s, it had received training from Cuba and arms from Moscow. The National Front for the Liberation of Angola, the FNLA, operated largely in the north of the country. Its leader, Holden Roberto, a strident anti-communist, had close links with neighboring Zaire, which supplied him with outdated American arms. The National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, was based in the south of Angola. A charismatic leader, Savimbi decided that American backing was the key to power. At Alvor in Portugal, the three rival groups got together. They agreed on arrangements for independence and elections.
The United States scotched that, absolutely. Our solution was the CIA, without approval from the National Security Council, delivered $300,000 to Holden Roberto and ordered him to send his people into northern Angola.
We weren't worried about receiving American aid. We knew that the Soviet Union was supporting the MPLA, and we had no possibility of countering that.
Secretly channeled through Zaire, American money helped pay for Roberto's war on the MPLA.
His side was always the bloodiest, the most violent. They went down and promptly killed 15 MPLA political activists. And from that time on, it was all cast, the fate of Angola was cast, it was written in blood.
The Americans were not sure that Roberto's troops could defeat the MPLA. The Central Intelligence Agency sent John Stockwell to investigate.
Roberto said he had 30,000. I had trouble counting 30. Badly armed, disorganized, kind of rabble kind of troops. And he was a cocktail party cowboy. He'd spent his whole career politicking in Kinshasa. Okay. He knew nothing of military operations or logistics or organization.
Then Stockwell went south to UNITA's headquarters. Stockwell met UNITA's leader, Jonas Savimbi.
I found a different kind of a revolutionary. He'd spent the entire time inside Angola, 20 years. He had led the guerrilla fighting himself.
Whatever the consequences, whatever the results, we will continue to fight because we don't want to be slaves of Russia in Angola, in our own country.
America was now backing 2 of the 3 independence movements. Washington ruled out intervention in Angola with American troops. Instead, it turned, secretly, to South Africa.
The United States, at the highest level, requested assistance, or rather requested South Africa to go in and assist UNITA.
We did maintain a position of disapproval of apartheid. But on the other hand, the South African government was extremely powerful.
Suid-Afrika was in 'n posisie van isolasie.
South Africa was isolated. Although it was done secretly, it was good for South Africa to be cooperating with a big force.
Okay, everybody, so we're back. I think that gives you more than a clear background as to, at the time, why South Africa actually got themselves involved. So let me take you through now to my own personal history and experience. So in January 1975, I was called up to an infantry base. The infantry base furthest away from South Africa, 3,000 kilometers from Cape Town in Namibia. It was the only infantry base South Africa actually had outside of the South African border. I became a signaller over there with a couple of other Jewish guys until about July 1975, when basically things started happening. So in June 1975, you know, there was, as we mentioned, the handover, you know, they mentioned the handover in November of whoever was going to be in control of Angola. So in July 1975, while sitting at the base, and 1,000 troops were all on leave all over South Africa, the South African government all of a sudden decided that they're going to call back all these hundreds of troops and fly them up to the border, because there was this massive refugee problem now developing on the border as the fighting was taking place all over Angola, and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Portuguese were just packing up after hundreds of years of living there to try and leave with whatever possessions they could. So on the 12th of August 1975, after the hundreds of troops had actually been arrived back in Walvis Bay, we all flew out. A few companies flew out north to the border of Southwest Africa and Angola. I'll show you where we went to. So this map just shows briefly the flights we took on C-130s. We flew up to a place called Ruacana, which is, there was a very large hydroelectric plant over there with lots of engineers and foreign workers who were now being attacked by the MPLA. And we took over the small picture on the left-hand side. We took over a border post, which was a border and customs post. And so we were already inside Angola, just on the other side of the border. And that's where we were for the next 2 months. And what we did on a daily basis there, and this is a preemptive to the actual strike into Angola, is that you will see on the left-hand side, we had hundreds of cars literally coming by us every single day, being searched. There were certain interrogations as they were passing into Southwest Africa. You see the massive Ruacana waterfall on your right-hand side as well. And we were basically there to protect the local residents and keep the peace and etc. At the same time, I've just got a short mention of mercenaries in Shochat. There was a town 40 kilometers from us where there were about 50 Portuguese mercenaries who we had very good relationships with. They were also doing the vetting of the mercenary, of the refugees coming through to find if there were any MPLA people there. I never ever discovered who were paying these guys, so they were fairly crazy and dangerous, I would say. But it was probably the CIA, as we saw earlier on. So after 2 months of border duty, essentially, all of a sudden, my sergeant major comes up to me and says to me, Laurie, bring your sleeping bag and a toothbrush, we're going somewhere. And that's all I took, a toothbrush and maybe even a change of clothing. And we met up just a few kilometers away at Colec, where the actual dam itself was, in a surrounding area of trees hidden away from any roads. There were a few hundred troops there, armored cars, and all of a sudden we're seeing that all the vehicles are painted in camouflage, and they've got written UNITA on them, and FNLA and Viva, etc. We were given new uniforms, like these green uniforms. We took off our army boots. We took off our dog tags. None of the vehicles, as you can see from some of the pictures on the bottom, none of the vehicles had any identification of being South African vehicles. The armored cars that we had with us, you'll see on the right-hand side, were painted in yellow and green. And essentially, we had now become mercenaries. At the time, we weren't given any documentation to sign. We weren't explained anything other than the next day we were going to attack this one town called Ruacana somewhere inside Angola. Okay. So there we were. You can see the yellow line at the bottom of the screen, which is the border. And we drove up to this place called Ruacana, which was a big town on the river. And actually, we had given, yeah, you can see it over there. We actually stopped at a place called Nolila along the way. And unknown to us, we were not given instructions to continue to Ruacana, and we actually sat around for 2-3 days waiting till we got the go-ahead. I was the radio man who finally got this go-ahead. We got a code, attack, and we all jumped on the vehicles. And when I say jumped on the vehicles, I'm talking about a convoy of about 2-3 kilometers long with armed troops. These were all South African troops, by the way. We didn't have FNLA or black troops. We weren't even aware of that at all at this particular time, other than we were going to drive in and we were going to attack this fort of MPLA in a town called Ruacana. That's all we knew. So anyhow, we eventually get to this town and we drive in at full blast, and the fort is up on the hill on the left-hand side, and everybody jumps off. I didn't actually have a task at that point in time. I was just a radio guy. Stood next to the 81mm mortars who blew the hell out of this fort, not to mention the armored cars surrounding it. And there was one hell of a battle for about an hour. After the battle, we discovered that after sitting for 3 days in a town nearby, obviously word had got out and that all the MPLA had actually run away. Now you will see on the map over here, you'll see a bridge going across a river, okay? So after the attack and everything had quietened down, and this was the first time that South Africans had really been in any type of formal warfare type of situation since the Second World War. So everybody was green. We weren't prepared for it at all. And all of a sudden, a convoy starts driving through the road, through the town. And we see vehicle after vehicle of cattle trucks and all sorts of vehicles that I don't know where they got them from, of hundreds and hundreds of black soldiers armed to the teeth. We almost started shooting at them. They almost started shooting at us, because bless the South African military or whoever was behind this whole operation, they didn't tell one about the other force. But what we were looking at was essentially this force called Zulu, that had been trained for 2 months prior to this operation in southern Angola. They'd been trained by groups of recce's in preparation of this onslaught into Angola, how well it was planned and what the ultimate goals were. Nobody really knows, other than South Africa had an interest backed up by the CIA, to try and take over as much of Angola as possible by November the 11th. So these guys rode into town. We looked at them in awe. They looked at us, and we just had no idea what was going on. Either way, my sergeant major then says to me, Laurie, you and me, we're going to join the mercenaries. What does he mean by the mercenaries? I told you earlier on, there was this group of 50 freedom fighters called the ELP, some kind of Portuguese freedom fighting organization for the freedom of Angola. These guys had about 7 or 8 jeeps, but they had no idea how to operate radios. So we basically, myself and my sergeant major, the only 2 South Africans, joined them. We crossed the river that night and we slept on the other side of the river. Well, and for the next 2 weeks, we would now be the radio liaison between these 50 mercenaries and the South African force. So once Rosadas was taken, you can just see an idea of like a truck of what we saw, what I've just described, of these guys, with their rifles and just ready for action. And the war went on. So we started making our way up. Every day we traveled about 50 kilometers, taking town after town after town, after we eventually began an attack on the main city of southern Angola called Sada Bandeira, which you will see near the top there. Now, Sada Bandeira is a beautiful city, very, very European. You'll see 1 or 2 photos in the next slide. And one of the major, attractions, let's say, of Sada Bandeira, other than its population, was that they had a Cristo Rei, which is very similar to that we know from Rio de Janeiro, up on the hill. And the South African troops had received a notification that the MPLA had placed a whole lot of rockets and guns up on the hill above the city. So bless Laurie, I was, being the radio guy, I was then put together with one of the black groups, which was actually a group of about 100 bushmen. Other than the actual black fighters of the FNLA, along the Caprivi Strip, we all know that there were, plenty bushmen around there that had actually also been trained by South Africa. So the night before we joined them, we actually went around the south part of the city. The night before, it poured with rain. The bushmen laid down in their trenches along the side of the highway, which we were waiting for the attack in the morning. And they all went to sleep in the pouring rain, and myself and a couple of other white guys from the South African Defense Force, we sat underneath the trucks shivering the whole night. 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, we got up, and on foot, we walked up the hill to Cristo Rei to attack it on foot. And there I was, I'm the radio guy, taller than all the other bushmen next to me, with my antenna up in the air. I said, if anybody's going to get shot at by the MPLA, it's going to be me. Fortunately though, go back one, sorry. So fortunately, in the end, there was nobody over there. It was totally empty. And then we went back. I joined the ELP guys, these, crazy guys in their Jeeps. And we actually drove in and were told to take over the city. So there I was, once again, out of the 3 different attacks that took place on Sada Bandeira, the first being the armored cars that took over the airport. You can see a picture at the bottom right-hand side. So, in Angola, the first thing every time we did whenever we came to any city was to take over the airport. Once you've got the airport, then you take over the town itself. So I went in with the ELP guys, driving down into the town. We took over the town without very much fighting. They set themselves up, the ELP guys, they took over the local radio station, they took over the police force, and myself and my sergeant major got the VIP headquarters behind the police station. So we lived, myself and my sergeant major, the only 2 South Africans inside the city of Sada Bandeira for about 5 to 6 days. We had the time of our lives. It's a total different story. Maybe one day in my big book, you'll read it. We each got ourselves our own Jeeps. We drove around. We went to a disco at night. We went to see a movie. We went to the Grand Hotel. And basically, we had a real good time for 5 days until all of a sudden I got called to one day to the airport. There was a commandant over there, a lieutenant colonel, who was the second in charge of the Zulu force. He looked at me, he said, do you know to drive a Jeep? I said, yes. He says, well, now you're going to become my driver and signaler. And at that was the stage that myself and my sergeant major actually parted. Inside our bandera, we had already found a lot of weapons and a lot of camouflage clothing. So we threw away the uniforms that had been given to us by the South African Defense Force. And we started, you know, just wearing whatever we found. And so from then on, my next stage of the journey now was to be part of the Zulu headquarters. And then the battle continued. So we left Southern Bandera to make our way towards the coast. Okay. While I was in Southern Bandera, a bank manager came running up to us and shouting in Portuguese. And then we discovered he had spoken to one of the banks along the coast, and they had informed him that a ship of hundreds of Cuban fighters had arrived. And we passed that message on. So I was basically one of the first guys to actually notify the South African Defense Force that the Cubans were up against us, and it was really only a matter of time. So we came to this crossroads that you can see, not much on the map, but a town called Katang, where as we drove in, all of a sudden the rockets started flying all around us. And it took many hours for us to actually take control of the MPLA yields that they had been holding out on. And the very first Cuban soldier who was killed in Angola actually was killed at Katang. So it took us a whole day of fighting against these guys. And it was the first real major battle that South Africa actually had fought in Angola. We spent 2-3 days at Katang. You know, one of the major things that happened at Katang was all our black troops from the FNLA had never been shot at rockets. These guys had been living in the bush. So they all ran away, and years later we discovered that all the MPLA soldiers also had ran away. So it was essentially South Africa versus Cuba for the first time ever. Okay. We then moved on to the two major port cities of Benguela and Lobito. Benguela being a city that has got the railway line that goes all the way to Zaire, and that was a very critical part of the attack. When we arrived at Benguela then too, that was a major battle because the Cubans had set all their rockets up on the northern side of the city, waiting for us to move in. And as we moved in, they let loose with the Stalin organs, and the South African troops were totally outshot. We didn't have any weapons that could reach those distances of about over 12 to 15 kilometers. So it was a day-long battle against these Russian rockets, but we eventually moved in. We took over the airport's building, and they eventually moved out completely from the city. So from there, the next day, we already drove into Lobito, a very beautiful city, once again going straight to the airport, where there was no opposition. The MPLA had now fled. On the picture on the right-hand side, you can see the guys I was with, who are, you know, the colonel and commandants and majors of this was the HQ, you know, of the Zulu force. And so I was the driver of the second in command. There was another Portuguese guy, the driver of the other one. And why I'm telling you that is while we were in Lobito, you can go to the next one, I think already. Here you can see a picture of the airport. We lived in that building for 2 days. And on the second morning, this is just a story I have to tell. All of a sudden, a light plane arrives, a light jet, and we see newspaper people coming off with their cameras, starting to take pictures, walking towards the building. Now, nobody's supposed to know there's South Africans there. Okay, so we quickly hid away inside the building, and we sent out a Portuguese-speaking guy from Joburg, John de Silva, and he took his Jeep, he packed them in the Jeep, and he drove them up to the hills to meet the black troops of the FNLA. So when they eventually came back later, they got in the plane and off they went. And that night I listened to the BBC, and when asked if they'd seen South African troops in Angola, the answer was definitively no. They hadn't seen any South African troops, and that is the way we actually managed to con the world, I'd say, for at least another couple of weeks. Okay. So the battle continued day after day, 50 or 80 kilometers a day. So we started moving north to a lovely town called Novo Redondo further up. And this was now, we were like 150 kilometers away from Luanda. On the way to Novo Redondo, our forces were once again attacked by the Cubans, and the first South African soldier was then killed halfway between Lobito and Novo Redondo. So some of the South African troops had had enough, and they asked if they could be replaced. And at the same time, all these FNLA troops that you're seeing in this picture on the left-hand side, they said they had had enough. They refused to continue the battle. And what we had to do is to fly in the guy you see standing and talking to them. His name is Daniel Chapenda. He's Mobutu Seko Seku's brother-in-law. And he had been one of the heads of the MPLA, broke away to the FNLA, and we had to fly him in from the Congo to come and speak to the troops. And he ranted and raved for an hour, and then they eventually agreed to continue the battle. I'm standing just behind this picture somewhere along the line. I somehow didn't appear. Okay, so the battle continued. We went up, we took over this town called Novo Redondo, and we spent almost a week there. And we got stuck because this is where the Cubans finally stopped us in our tracks by blowing all the bridges across the rivers that led towards Luanda. Otherwise, we would have continued, and within 2 days, we would have probably arrived in Luanda. So you can see a picture at the bottom right-hand side of one of the bridges that had been blown. All the recce's special forces tried to find all alternative ways of getting past these rivers. They didn't manage to do that. And one other little tiny story about Novo Redondo is that when we went to meet the mayor of this town, a real black mama, if that's the only way I can describe, in this beautiful house we called it the Pink House. She was either the richest woman or the mayor of the town. We were sitting inside the building surrounded by all these little kids. And I looked to the side and I saw a Kodak Instamatic camera. And the woman looked at me and she saw me looking at the camera and she insisted that I take it. And as you all know, I'm a keen photographer, and all it was a little Instamatic. But back in Sada Bandera, I had gone into a shop and I had bought 2 spools of film. And between the 2 spools that I had already held for a few weeks, and with this camera, I finally had something that I could actually take some photos with as proof of where we had been and what had gone on. And I'll show you some of those photos soon. Here they are already. Okay. We eventually moved inland after the bridges had been blown. So we moved into a town called Sela, which is in the central part of Angola. Because we had been shot out, you will see on the right-hand side of the top, South Africa had to fly in artillery for the first time ever since the Second World War. And all they had was these little 25-pounders, which weren't much of a match for the Russian rockets. And after 2 weeks, we eventually brought in even bigger guns. On the bottom right-hand side, you will see just, this is the Jeep that we were driving in. You saw this picture in the beginning. This is the way we actually ran the war. Okay, here's a map that shows basically how we traveled over 3,000 kilometers inside Angola. You can see Luanda at the top, and you can actually see how close we actually did arrive at Luanda compared to where the yellow line at the bottom of the border that you see. So you'll see that we went up to Novo Redondo along the coast, and then we made our way back, and then we moved back in to this place called Sela, where you'll see that there's a mention there of Breach 14. South African troops were totally blown out just before Breach 14. They walked into a Cuban trap and many were killed. And that was just the day before we arrived. So I actually wasn't there at that particular point in time. And this is where there was a stalemate, and the stalemate continued, can continue. So for about 2 weeks, I lived over here. You can see a picture of myself on the left-hand side. All the houses look like this. It was a place they called it the pig farm. And it was just a rural area. The hills that you see behind on the right-hand side are where the Cubans were. So they were literally just a few kilometers away from us. They didn't attack us. We didn't attack them for about 2 weeks. You can see on the right-hand side, we brought in the big guns. So the Cubans were dead scared of these. These were the 5.5-inch guns that we were shooting at them and out shooting their rockets. So after about 2 weeks of bombardments backwards and forwards and the stalemate, you can see on the right-hand side the famous Breach 14, which was totally blown up. South Africa went and tried to rebuild it. You can see a small picture of me in the middle over there at the bottom as well. By the way, only one of the 2 spools eventually came out. So I don't know, I did lose quite a number of photos. And here we are at Celle Airport. So one of my visits, we were there for almost 2 weeks and we'd be driving up and down, backwards and forwards. The one day I went to the airport at Celle where, by the way, South Africa was now really involved. From just 150 odd South African soldiers who went in the Zulu task force in the beginning, there were now 4 different task forces, not only Zulu. And South Africa was now literally flying in its troops into this airport at Celle by the hundreds. Apparently, just a few days after these photos were taken, there were already almost 3,000 South African troops in Angola. They were no longer wearing all these uniforms that we had found for ourselves, but they were wearing regular South African army uniforms. What you see over here, when I was at the airport, I met up with my old buddies from the ELP. So we were, we had separated paths a couple of weeks beforehand. And just these are some of the recollections. On that day at the airport, I also took this very, very meaningful picture on the left-hand side. You see a C-130 plane arriving from Pretoria or Grootfontein base. And you also see a Cessna plane. Now, on the right-hand side, you see an original note that this aircraft was actually shot down by the MPLA near Ebo, and the 3 officers on that plane, it was a spotter plane, were killed. Their bodies were only found about 20 years later. About 10 years ago, I was involved with some people who were part of a group trying to find the bodies of the guys who had been shot down, and they eventually did find them in 2006. So we made us, after we being the very, very last of the Zulu force that had gone into Angola 2 months beforehand, we were finally allowed to leave. We were really tired out. All the new forces that had already replaced us. And so a handful of us and the remaining FNLA troops made our way down. Took us 3 days to get back to the border at Rundu. And we dropped off the remaining FNLA troops on the way. We crossed into Rundu. The MPs, the military police, looked at us, and we had already heard about them, that basically the way South Africa kept this whole operation totally top secret is that all troops that arrived back on the border were totally strip searched. Their uniforms were taken off, their guns were taken away, and they were given new guns, brand new South African Army uniforms, and whatever mementos that they had managed to keep were taken away from them. And in this way, the South African government maintained a total cloud of secrecy from its population back in South Africa, that we had just not been involved whatsoever. They hadn't sent any, there was no filming, there was no photography, there were no reporters whatsoever. So the only recollections that we do have in the group, for instance, are individual photos that people managed to smuggle out themselves. So when we went into the Rundu base, the MPs looked at us, but you can see what we looked like over here in the photos. The guy standing in the middle on the left hand, in the middle of the picture on the left, that is Commandant Breitenbach, who was the officer commander of the Recce's. The guy on the right hand side was a Portuguese Secret Service guy who actually was killed also just a couple of weeks later. We arrived there, they didn't dare search us. And after a day at Rundu, I managed to make my way back to the Southwest African border. You can see it was another 600-700 kilometers. First to Grootfontein, where I found myself in one of South Africa's largest army bases, where everybody was, neatly shaven in South African uniform. And there I was in a camouflage uniform, long hair, an AK-47, no identification. And all I wanted to do was get back to Walvis Bay after 4 months. I was totally on my own without any other troops from my unit. And it took me 3 days to finally convince the sergeant major of this massive base to provide me a train ticket and to provide me a uniform and to provide me with a new gun. Because the last thing I could do was get on a train dressed the way I was and have people ask me all these questions. So it took me 3 days. I got that. I made my way back, walked into the Walvis Bay base, which was still totally empty. It was now the 15th of December. We were supposed to claw out or get out of the army at the end of December, just after Christmas. But all the other troops from the base were still all spread out all over Angola. And you can change. And only a week later, while slowly but surely the train started arriving and everybody started arriving back. And when they arrived back, totally unknown to me, you know, my mates, especially the guys from Worcester, when they walked into the base and they saw me, they were totally flabbergasted because they had learned that I was killed in action, that that I had died. It's a long story. I haven't got time to get into it, but basically you will recall that I on the tarmac of the airport at Sada Bandera, I separated from my sergeant major. He never ever saw me again, but he got involved in some major clash about a month later somewhere in Angola, and he got shot up and he went, in Afrikaans you say bos befok. He lost his marbles a little bit. And when he went back and met up with guys from my unit, wherever it was, back on the border, and they said, hold on, you went into Angola with Laurie, where is he now? And he just mumbled all sorts of things that, well, I was a goner. And here I have proof, 2 little items of proof of my story. On the right-hand side, you see notes. I don't know if Charlie Rubin is on this call or not, but most of you guys will know Charles or maybe at least Brian, or his 2 brothers. So Charles Rubin wrote in the notes on the right-hand side, I'll just read it out in these 2 notes. The one he found a couple of years ago, he found this notebook that he used to take notes. Charles was also up in Angola in another town completely. I didn't even know he was there. He was a medic, okay? And he wrote as follows: I hear that Laurie Shochat has disappeared in Angola. Shit, that's the one, the message at the bottom. And the one at the top, he says, I think we are wasting our time here. While 30 people are dead and 100 injured, it seems also that Laurie is dead. That's very nice of him to remember me that way. Thank you, Charles. And on the left-hand side, just a couple of years ago, my daughter received a message on Facebook. And it says as follows: Hi, Lital, I presume you're the daughter of Laurie. Laurie was a signaller with me in Tusai. We served together in Angola and Ruacana. And I heard he was killed in action and have been sad for the last 37 years. I was delighted to learn otherwise a week ago. So that message came out of the blue after 37 years. Okay, so a little epilogue. So as I mentioned, you see on the right-hand side, the picture of the 4 South Africans. These guys, they were just tiffies. They were just admin guys who got in a vehicle and they drove north along the road, and we had no roadblocks, and they drove straight into the Cuban soldiers. They were caught. They were shown to the press all over the world. One of the most embarrassing things for South Africa, because South Africa couldn't deny its involvement anymore. And subsequent to that, South Africa eventually did pull out of Angola by February 1976. As you saw in the movie, once word had got out, the American government couldn't keep supplying money to the different units. On the contrary, there was something called, there was an amendment that was passed in the Senate in February 1976, I'm sorry, saying that the CIA has to cease all involvement whatsoever in Angola. So without American backing, South Africa was just left on its own, and a decision was made to pull out. So I left Angola in the middle of December. South African troops, there were thousands there by now. It took them another 2 months to get their act together and slowly but surely pull out. And in the beginning of March, I believe, 1976, all the South African troops had already left. Okay. Just a last note then on this, you'll see that we have our Facebook group. There's just some pictures of the guys together. Very, very frustrated group of about 600 veterans. We share our stories, facts, photos. There one or two are writing books. They have an annual remembrance gathering in Pretoria every single year. And there's still a lot of frustration in that most of them never ever received acknowledgement, medals, or support. We basically left the army, we were strip searched and just sent home without any type of thank you, handshake or anything, just disappear, go back to South Africa. Most of these guys who actually came later, far later than I did, had to sign secrecy forms. So they weren't even allowed to tell their story or share it with anybody. And they didn't until very, very recently. Thank you everybody for sharing.
Laurie, thank you so much for sharing that most fascinating experience and with us. So I see that you have lots of caring friends and family around you here, and I'm sure that everybody would like to unmute themselves, send you a kiss and ask you a question. Maybe we can start with first person to raise their hand. Manya. We can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Hello, Teddy. I hadn't prepared any questions, but I do remember being at home in Worcester when Laurie was in the army, and there was very little communication, but he managed to write a couple of words in Hebrew that we could read in English. That was the only thing we knew, well, where he was at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, Manya, that was one particular letter that I never ever found, but basically a South African Air Force pilot landed on a highway. So I went up to him and I quickly wrote a letter and I put it in an envelope. And the only way I could tell you guys that I was in Angola is that I said, and now I'm wishing you for the Chagim, and I wrote the words in Hebrew.
Aniba Angola.
Yeah, so the censors, when they censored out everything, they don't understand the Hebrew. So that was the only message I ever managed to get through.
Okay.
Wow, unbelievable.
Well done, Lol.
Again, a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. You're welcome to unmute yourselves and say hello to Laurie and ask a question. Anybody like to ask? Anyway, again, thank you so much. There are some in the chat. Aviva, if you can see what's in the chat and read it.
Everyone is saying thank you for such an amazing talk.
Great, Laurie, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Again, a warm welcome to everybody and thank you for joining. Before we all go away this evening, I wanted to remind you about two upcoming events in the next days. We have an event on Tuesday, this Tuesday at 8 o'clock with former MK Dov Lipman on honest reporting. So I would welcome you all to join us. On Thursday, the 24th of December, on Thursday also at 8 o'clock, we've got a panel put together to discuss corona vaccine with Dr. Karen Schuh and Dr. Gail Lusting and Dr. Rhoda Bagwin. Check the Telfed website to find more details about the event.
I just want to say one last word, Teddy, because I see over here. Yeah, I see over here that that my good friend Tony Mayer is also here. He was in Walvis Bay with us. They were the only Jewish family in Walvis Bay, and they were the guys who looked after the couple of Jewish guys in the camp. We went there for Friday nights, and they provided the only little bit of, let's say, Jewish Yiddishkeit support that we had throughout that whole year. Thanks a lot there.
How amazing.
Just
what a wonderful...
say something on a personal note.
Sure, Musket.
So just after knowing Laurie for 1 or 2 years back, you know, I heard about this story for a long time, still waiting for his book to come out. But I can tell you, it's very exciting to hear him eventually telling his story, because it's the first time that actually it came out loudly out. So well done. Even with one eye, But I think there's so much information. There's so much information there that it's really not easy to absorb it all. But I'm sure it will come out. It will be a lot of people will be able to get more information out of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Laurie. It was fascinating. And thank you for giving us of your time. We appreciate it so much.
Laurie, this is Tony speaking. Thank you. Really, really interesting. And best regard from Germany.
Yeah. Keep well, Tony.
Wonderful. I think there might have been a few more families in Walvis Bay, but thank you for them at least. Yes, Desmond, would you like to say something?
I'd like to say something interesting. I served in Walvis Bay 2 Side Battalion from 77 to January 78. And amongst the troops that were there, we didn't hear any of this, really. It's amazing, your story. I actually left in August of 77. I left Walvis Bay to go to Pretoria. So it's awesome story.
Just hid it away, as if it didn't exist.
As if it didn't exist. Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some of the officers that were in charge of us must have known about what was going on. Surely.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Laurie, I don't know if you noticed, but you have some other friends of yours online that were with you in the unit. Gary, would you like to share some time with Laurie for a second, Gary?
Yeah, I was actually an artillery 5.5 gunner at the time, and I finished my service in Angola in late February, early March in 76. I was an artillery OP observer, and I did the artillery of OP at the Battle of Bridge 14, where there were just two of us actually behind enemy Cuban lines at the time. And there was one error that Laurie just made there. The 5.5 gun at the time had a range, a maximum range of 18 kilometers. And the Stalin organ, the BM-21s, actually had a range of 25 kilometers. So what actually was happening then was that they knew that our maximum range was 18 kilometers, and that they would put their artillery just too far for us to reach. And that was one of the issues that we came across. And subsequent to that, the 155 millimeter gun was developed, which was a standard weapon, which was later used by NATO, and I still think it is a standard artillery weapon at the moment. But what we did was, in order to counteract that incredible range, and we only had 4 5.5 guns during the entire battle, was we would move one gun forward a kilometer at a time. The other 3 guns would continue firing, and then that gun would resume, that would move forward, and then the other, one by one, we did this leapfrog action, forward, 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 until we got 2 within range. And they never realized until we let loose towards the end that we had moved up 6 or 7 kilometers, and we actually had them, I could actually physically see the gun positions at the time. Yeah, so that's about it from me. So
thank you, Gary, for sharing that with us. So if anybody else would like to say a good hello, I see we have lots of data room online. I'd like to say hello to them all. I see we have joining us Joey Benedretti today, Max Paul today. So hello to you all. Maybe we'd just like to share a video for a second and give us all a wave. Max Paul, Jeff Abramovitz, then Lipschitz.
Hi, Graham. How's it, my boy?
Graham Serene. Anyway, Laurie, again, thank you very much.
Okay.
It looks like we have a bit of a shark crowd on the background, so Graham's going to say something. Go ahead, Graham.
I came to listen to Laurie because I missed that accent. I mean, it's like he left Worcester.
Well, that will teach you for going to Boston.
Teddy.
And that will teach you for going to Dubai. So I would be quiet.
Teddy, I'd just like to say something, if I may.
Certainly.
Hi, Laurie. It's May Shazikson. I'm in Dubai at the moment. It's interesting hearing this from you because in 1975, I was doing my military service as well. I was at One Mile Hospital in Huerta, and we had the Cuban casualties coming to the hospital over there. And they were taken to the bottom end of the hospital where no one was supposed to know anything about them. We obviously heard, because we were at the hospital, we heard what was going on with the Cubans, but we didn't know what was going on in Angola. However, the railway line, the siding was right near us as well. And we saw for a few days, through the night, the whole day, the whole night, there was loadings of all ammunitions and vehicles and everything. So we knew something big was going on. But even though I was there at One Mil, I didn't know the story of what was going on. Obviously, I've heard some from friends of mine who've come out. But thank you so much for this presentation. It was most interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
Teddy, you're on mute again.
Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Well, now it looks like you want to tell us a story. No? Anyway, so before we say goodnight, just a reminder about the upcoming events. We do have on coming Tuesday, Dov Lippman with Honest Reporting. And on Thursday, a special event that we've just put together with a good team of doctors, a panel actually discussion. And it will be with doctors from some of the health funds from Klalit, as well as Maccabi, Doctors Karen Shu and Gail Lusting and Rhoda Bagman. So please join us on Thursday evening and ask questions about the corona vaccine. And then the last event of the year, finale, is a virtual tour of Tanzania with Cindy Klein, and we look forward to that as well. A good night to you all, and thank you for joining me.
Bye.
Thank you so much again, Laurie. Appreciated.
I enjoyed. Bye.